Remember when we were talking about Aristotle's rhetoric? I guess I finally did. Well, hi, and welcome back, first to the show, and second to our discussion of Aristotle's rhetoric. We've already talked about how Aristotle defined rhetoric and explained why it's useful, and as we did so, we also discussed how his approach to rhetoric was a far cry from the harsh condemnations that were issued against it by earlier philosophers like Plato. Sure, rhetoric isn't engaged in the same search for absolute truth as philosophy, but that's just because it's more interested in getting things done with the truths we already have. And that's what we're talking about today. After defining rhetoric and justifying its usefulness as a counterpart to philosophical dialectic, Aristotle goes on to explain just what it is that rhetoric does and how it works. And it wouldn't be Aristotle if he wasn't dividing things into smaller and smaller categories, so it's no surprise that he starts by dividing rhetoric into 3 different species, all of which serve a different purpose and work in slightly different ways. As Aristotle puts it, a speech consists of 3 things: a speaker and a subject on which he speaks, and someone addressed. And the objective of the speech relates to the last, I mean the hearer. He then explains that audiences, at least in his day, are composed of primarily 3 different groups of people: democratic assemblies who make judgments about the future, jurors who make judgments about the past, and observers who want to take in the speaker's abilities. And since each of these audiences brings with it a different rhetorical purpose, this enables Aristotle to define the 3 species of rhetoric as deliberative, judicial, and epideictic. Deliberative rhetoric is the kind of rhetoric that addresses a democratic assembly, the kind of people that make decisions about laws, taxes, war, and all the other things that governments have to take care of. And the name deliberative rhetoric helps us to understand that it's what happens when people are deliberating, weighing multiple different options in order to determine the best course of action. So Aristotle explains that deliberative rhetoric is primarily concerned with the future. Should we go to war? Should we lower taxes? Should we outlaw the tiresome pedantry of philosophers? When these types of urgent social and societal crises arise, we don't have the luxury of working through a long philosophical process to determine the one cosmically true course of action. And that's because the Spartans will have already invaded and wiped us out by then. So instead, we rely on the agility of deliberative rhetoric to weigh multiple proposals against one another and determine which one will serve us best. As such, Aristotle points out that the goal of a deliberative speaker is to articulate the advantageous and the harmful, for someone urging something advises it as the better course, and one dissuading dissuades on the ground that it is worse. That is, future-oriented deliberative rhetoric is all about deciding whether something will help us in the future or harm us. For example, would lowering property taxes help a city or do more harm than good? There isn't a single obvious answer to a question like that, so people with different opinions will make their case in order to persuade their audience to adopt a particular course of action. If I'm honest, deliberative rhetoric is what I'm thinking about most often when I think of rhetoric. It's the persuading people to do things rhetoric. The rhetoric of buy our product, or vote for our candidate, or let's get pizza instead of sandwiches for lunch. But we get more insight than just a description of this type of rhetoric. Remember, Aristotle says that his species of rhetoric are defined by the rhetorical purpose that comes along with it. So we can see that when we're trying to persuade somebody to do something, when we're working with deliberative rhetoric, our goal really is as simple as showing them that one action will either be helpful or harmful. And sure, there's more complexity in real life, but this simplicity can be really useful. So whatever your purpose, whatever your research, whatever your sources, your one job should be to show your audience that whatever it is that you're proposing will be beneficial to them. Do that effectively, and you probably won't have to wonder as much about what the future holds. Now, I bet you'll never guess where judicial rhetoric happens. And if you guessed the courts, you'd be right. Where a deliberative speaker is focused on what's happening in the future, Aristotle points out that a judicial speaker is focused on the past, for he always prosecutes or defends concerning what has been done. And that probably makes intuitive sense. If you've ever seen a courtroom scene play out, you know that people are never arguing about what will happen. They're always talking about what has happened, trying to establish the facts of a case and explain the motives of the people involved. Was the plaintiff being punched or just hit? Was the defendant a hapless victim of an uncontrolled monster or a subtle and conniving perpetrator of violence? What, if anything, did friends, relatives, and staff observe at the time? Where witnesses are limited and it's one person's word against another, it's really difficult to define exactly what happened, and so we're left to talk about what is or isn't more likely. Just as the future is uncertain and unknowable, events in the past can also be shrouded in uncertainty. And it's in that uncertainty that rhetoric does its best work. So parties on both sides of a dispute present their evidence and interpretation of events in order to establish whether what happened was just or unjust. We might wonder whether somebody's actions were a justified response to years of mistreatment or an unjustified pattern of malice. And of course, we don't just look backwards in legal proceedings. Judicial rhetoric is even at work when a student emails a teacher to explain why they missed class for a particular day. They're working to show that their absence was justified, usually by providing way too much personal and medical detail that the teacher doesn't even need. And as uncomfortable and unnecessary as it ultimately is, it's easy to see why it happens. I don't need to know all the gory details of your violent illness or the reasons that you were in court on a particular day. But I also understand that they're being included as a way of justifying that absence. So keep that in mind. When you know your audience, you're in a better position to know what you need to do in order to persuade them that a past event was justified and what kinds of details you probably don't need to include. And now we come to my most favorite of all the species of rhetoric, epideictic rhetoric. On the one hand, I like it because it has a fun name. On the other, I love it because it's the most fun to do. Epideictic rhetoric has a name that means to indicate or point, and it's related to the word index, like your pointer finger. And the fun of it all comes in the fact that the audience of epideictic rhetoric isn't really trying to make a decision. As Aristotle points out, they're there to see the skill of the speaker, or as I might put it, to revel in the rhetorical display. Epideictic rhetoric is the rhetoric of praise and blame, the end of which is to highlight the honorable or the shameful. It's rhetoric that's more closely tied to the present, to showing us what we value and admire right now. Because the audience is here to observe the speaker rather than to make a decision, epideictic rhetoric is also marked by a more conscious attention to style and linguistic virtuosity. In Aristotle's day, it was frequently used at funerals to showcase the honorable or shameful character of the deceased. Richard Lanham describes how the Greek orator Gorgias leverages style in his epideictic address honoring some Athenian dead by saying, "The meaning is not weakened by the style, but reinforced. For it is the style which metamorphoses the grief into pleasure, makes us forget grief in the tremendous pleasure of expressing it." Thus, Gorgias is able to honor the dead and the grief of his audience by evoking the pleasure of expressing that grief, turning it perhaps into something a little more redemptive and hopeful. Where other species of rhetoric are concerned about what we're going to do or how we're going to judge what already happened, epideictic rhetoric tends just to point at something and say, "Look at this," often following up by saying, "Isn't that amazing?" but also occasionally saying, "Oh, how awful." Either way, epideictic rhetoric is the rhetoric of display, expressing feelings of praise or blame. You might even say that it's rhetoric for its own sake. A rhetorical theorist and friend of the show, name of Kenneth Burke, called that pure persuasion, the saying of something, not for an extra verbal advantage to be got by the saying, but because of a satisfaction intrinsic to the saying. And seriously, what could be better than that? It's in eulogies, poetry, easy conversations on a summer evening. While the other species of rhetoric do valuable work, epideictic rhetoric luxuriates in the joy of it all. And yes, this has been epideictic rhetoric in praise of epideictic rhetoric. Try and think of even one thing more fun than that. And so, dear friends, we have the three species of rhetoric: the deliberative, the judicial, and the epideictic. It's worth pointing out that even though Aristotle presents these as pretty cleanly distinct categories, the boundaries are of course a little fuzzier than presented. All speakers can praise and blame, make reference to the past, or project into the future. However, Aristotle's framing is still useful because it shows us that the audience can control our rhetorical purpose. It can help to inform our rhetorical strategy. Are we trying to persuade, to justify, or to delight? We'll do different things depending on what we're trying to accomplish, and being clear about our objective will help us to find the right strategies. In fact, Aristotle spends a good chunk of his rhetoric explaining the various strategies that go along with these different species of rhetoric. He does, after all, define rhetoric as the knowledge of the available means of persuasion, so it makes sense that he would put a lot of effort into outlining all of them. But that's a topic, or topics, for another day. In the meantime, though, let me know if you have any questions or share other insights you have into Aristotle's rhetoric. There's always more that we could say. And of course we will, soon. Until then, though, thanks for watching, and take care.